ba ba da 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 ba 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 da da da. And he's not afraid of.
There were a lot of superhero parody series in the 90s, Darkwing Duck, Freakazoid, Powerpuff Girls, but in my mind none was funnier or more original than The Tick. I can't think of any property that better pulled off being entirely derivative and yet totally unique all at the same time. The Tick is a very familiar universe, filled with costumed heroes fighting costume villains, huge bad guy plots, monologues, sidekicks, superhero teams, arch nemesis, battle cries, pretty much everything you would expect. And any comic book fan can easily point to the genesis of a lot of Ben Edlund's ideas. In fact, he often invites you to. You couldn't have the Tick without Adam West's Batman, as the Tick and Arthur is obviously a Batman and Robin dynamic, except hugely exaggerated, and the Tick has a similar dramatic and charmingly egotistical flair to that of Adam West. But there's also some Superman in him, and that he's nearly indestructible, or nigh invulnerable, as he likes to say. And while he's witty and has the occasional moment of brilliant lucidity, a philosophical idea that really makes you stop and rethink everything for just a second, he's a borderline lunatic with no common sense. But he does have a heart of gold, cares about all the right things for all the right reasons. He just also happens to be dumb as bricks. So he always wins in spite of himself. He's huge, he's super strong, and so like Superman, he's just plain hard to beat in battle. But he's also smart enough to know that he needs someone to ground him, to be level-headed and come up with the actual, strategies and stuff. He's always impressed and intrigued with Arthur for constantly thinking, while he gets fixated on trying to look, act, and sound like a superhero. And also, as he says in The Tick vs. Protoclown, he's easily distracted by shiny objects. And as the series goes on, you've got the Civic-Minded Five, obviously a parody of the Fantastic Four, and you've got Omnipotus in the episode Alone Together, who's Galactus, except he more literally eats worlds, picking them up and munching on them. American Maid and Captain Liberty are parodies of Wonder Woman, and Deflator Mouse and Batman Well are parodies of Batman. The list goes on and on. But each of these spoofs very much becomes its own thing. Deflator Mouse isn't funny because he's supposed to be Batman, he's funny because he's a complete coward and never actually fights anyone or does much of anything. Big Shot isn't funny just because he's supposed to be the Punisher, he's funny because he has a condition that makes him compulsively shoot guns, and he's in therapy through the entire animated show. All three incarnations of The Tick, the comics, the animated show, and the live-action show, are highly stylized universes filled with the absurd, the bizarre, the implausible, and the hilarious. And yet, it's not the formulaic camp of the 60s Batman series, which worked, but in an entirely different way. A lot of the basic fundamentals of good storytelling are still intact in these shows. Often, real stories actually get told despite the comedy. There are themes and character arcs, but the big rule Edlund breaks as a rule for these shows is that the Tick is the one thing that never changes, and that's the joke. We don't know who he is, where he comes from, and in every incarnation, it's never even determined if the Tick is wearing a costume or if he was somehow born that way. He always insists it's not a costume. As he says in the animated pilot, I am simply the Tick. And in a great bit, when someone questions that and says Tick suck blood, he gets defensive and says, I got a straw right here, pal, you want a demonstration? Arthur is our straight man, the closest thing this universe has to a regular guy, so the audience has someone to relate to. And so he's the one with the character arcs. He changes and grows, but the Tick, try as he might, never really does. And a lot of comedy comes from that basic idea. The best example of this is perhaps the Tick versus Arthur's bank account, where the Tick maxes out Arthur's credit cards to buy crime-busting equipment. Arthur kicks him out of the apartment, and in the end they make up, but the Tick obviously hasn't learned much. He tells Arthur that he forgives him, and Arthur says, you can't forgive me, I forgive you. And then periodically throughout the rest of the series, the Tick continues to obsess about crime-fighting gadgets. But he's also consistent in all the ways that make him a genuinely lovable character. He's naively optimistic and he unwaveringly believes in justice. It's impossible to completely understand who he is, but we do understand why he wants so desperately to be a superhero. Now, this is extremely absurdist comedy, and it's certainly not for everyone. I've shown some episodes of both shows to several people over the years who have responded with the phrase, I just don't get it. But I find The Tick highly creative. The humor in both the animated and live-action versions are very clever, and sometimes extremely sophisticated despite the genre. In some ways, the two series are trying to do the same thing, and in other ways, they're entirely different. So we're going to engage in a classic high school English compare and contrast exercise, looking at specifically the two series' first episodes. What are each trying to be? Who are the Tick and Arthur in each show? How is the comedy different? And who is each show for? Ben Edlund, much like Todd McFarlane with his various incarnations of Spawn, loves seeing his character in different mediums, but he doesn't keep telling the same stories the same way over and over again. And side note, if you're not familiar with Ben Edlund, he's done a lot of other things besides The Tick, including being a producer on Angel and writing the fan favorite Smile Time, and producing and writing on Supernatural. And The Tick is geared towards slightly different audiences in each version, so interestingly, The Tick himself becomes a slightly different character in each version. The weirdest and most bizarre, hands down, is The Tick in the comics, where our first introduction of him is seeing him break out of a mental institution to run off and be a superhero. He also carries around a Viewmaster and looks through it periodically as if it somehow helps him fight crime. The Tick was, of course, an underground comic, and so it plays as a parody of superheroes specifically for people who know superheroes, so it's filled with somewhat obscure references, and at times the humor is pretty adult. Then, with the animated show, the Tick is still a pretty weird character, and it definitely gets about as bizarre as you can get away with on a Fox Saturday morning cartoon, with episodes like Armless But Not Harmless, where the Tick and Arthur's arms actually fall off. But it's certainly more harmless for kids than the comics or the live-action shows, but no less sophisticated, and is without question my favorite version. Both of these versions, of course, follow the Tick on patrol and see him often fighting supervillains and doing regular superhero stuff. But the live-action version was billed as a sitcom, and as director Barry Sonnenfeld mentions in the commentary, is generally more about what the superheroes in this universe do on their off time than it is about foiling supervillain plots, though the Tick does foil one in the pilot. Barry Sonnenfeld, by the way, directed the Men in Black films and cast Patrick Warburton in a cameo as Agent T, which was a direct nod to this role, and he basically played the exact same character. Patrick Warburton's Tick is more of an airhead, I think, than either of the other versions, and his thought process is maybe even more non sequitur, but still has the same bizarre lingo all his own, and the adult humor puts its tone a little closer to the comics than the cartoon. But despite being marketed for different demographics, the two pilots accomplish basically the same thing. Get the audience used to the Tick and his wacky way of thinking and talking, get him and Arthur together for the first time, and show that despite his apparent insanity, he actually can save the day. They're not really origin stories for the Tick himself, because part of the joke is that we'll never really get that, but really more of an origin for Arthur. As I said, you could make the argument that despite the title, Arthur is really the protagonist. The story for each pilot is nearly the same, with different details and different focuses. Arthur quits his job to become a superhero. The Tick moves to the city to declare himself its protector. He meets Arthur in a particularly awkward way. He goes to Arthur's apartment and is disappointed to find that it isn't really a superhero headquarters. Arthur meets some other superheroes who aren't exactly the fearless and competent crime fighters he was expecting. Between that and worrying he won't really be able to fly with those flimsy moth wings, becomes disillusioned with the whole idea of being a superhero. The Tick gives him a stirring speech about how it's his destiny to be a hero. They foil a villain plot and decide to be a duo from then on, and at some point in the episode, the Tick falls from a high place and declares, "Gravity is a harsh mistress." There are 3 scenes that exist in both episodes, but they're both done in different enough ways in the live-action series that they don't feel too recycled or unnecessary. The first is the scene where Arthur quits his accounting job, necessary to his character development, of course, and Mr. Wiederspan from the cartoon is replaced by Mr. Fishladder in a hilarious cameo by none other than Christopher Lloyd, who clearly lays the fork in the road that is Arthur's future out in front of him by saying, "The way I see it, you're either an accountant or an idiot in a bunny suit. You can't be both." The second is that scene, which is really funny in both versions, where the Tick walks around Arthur's apartment looking for the secret headquarters trigger. The best line from the cartoon is also in the live-action version, but it's so funny, who cares? The Tick says, "What does your sofa turn into?" And Arthur responds with, "It turns into a bed." The Tick then says, "Well, that's a start." And the last is the scene where Tick and Arthur meet the 2 other prominent superheroes on a roof for the first time. Deflator Mouse and American Made in the cartoon, and of course Batmanuel and Captain Liberty in the live-action show. This one plays quite differently because in the live-action show, it's played for sexual comedy, with Batmanuel and Captain Liberty fighting and insulting each other, and then they start making out. The big joke being that the Tick has no idea what's going on anytime one of them makes a reference to sex. I never noticed this until after I watched the live-action pilot, but there's a hint of this going on in the cartoon, but it's naturally a lot more subtle, with American Made talking about Deflator Mouse's fear of commitment. It's interesting to note that the live-action show felt it needed Deflator Mouse and American Made type characters since they didn't exist in the comics. But this being a sitcom, I guess it makes sense that they'd want more supporting characters for the main two to banter with. And I guess they figured they couldn't get a lot of comedy mileage out of Paul the Samurai and Oedipus, the comic book's parody of Elektra. At the start, for fans of the cartoon, these two really felt like unnecessary knockoffs of Deflator Mouse and American Made. Deflator Mouse and Batman Well are certainly closer characters than American Made and Captain Liberty, both cowardly womanizers who are just superheroes for the publicity and because they think they look good in their costumes, and they both even have cars that break down all the time. But Batman Well is different enough with his cool Spanish thing, whereas American Made is always no-nonsense and completely cool-headed. Everyone has to take her seriously despite the fact that she throws her shoes at people. And Captain Liberty is more of the corporate tool who takes herself too seriously and is overly sexualized by everyone. She's the one big missed opportunity in the series, in my opinion. Liz Vassy is wonderfully cast, and I love how she rattles off really fast lines with ease, but Liberty's pathetic, and that's supposed to be funny, but it rarely is. Ben Edlund loves to make fun of history, especially the darker parts of it. He doesn't really comment on it so much as uses it in silly and fun ways. A lot of the best puns in the Tick come from historical references. Edlund seems to have the philosophy that we as a society take ourselves too seriously, and we should sometimes take a moment to sit back and laugh at how preposterous real life can be. So if he's making any statement at all with the Tick, it's to create something truly absurd to showcase the absurdities that can be found in real life. In the live-action pilot, the villain is the Red Scare, a revamp of the comic character who's a totally different thing here. A robot created in 1979 by the Soviets to kill Jimmy Carter, now reprogrammed by some terrorists to kill the Postmaster General. Through this, we get great Tick lines like, "Too late we find that communism does not pay." And the plot is too ridiculous not to be entertaining. The terrorists can't reprogram the robot before Tick and Arthur thwart them. "See, Arthur? You thwart." And Jimmy Carter just happens to be in town. "Heavens to Betsy, what are the odds?" So they have to stop him from killing the ex-president. By the way, you can get away with these kinds of conveniences when you're doing absurdist comedy, and that's part of the gag. There are a lot of these historical jokes in the cartoon series too, especially with the Terror episodes, which make fun of Stalin, among other things. But we don't really get a lot of that in the pilot. The cartoon's first episode focuses a lot more on the superhero parodies, which the live-action show kind of avoids as a matter of course, leaving out a lot of the straight nods to specific superheroes the cartoon is inundated with. The big villain here is actually another group of terrorists called the Idea Men, which look like they came right out of a Max Fleischer Superman cartoon. And instead of any political agenda, they just want to hold the city for ransom and make a lot of money so they don't have to work anymore. A plot that subverts your usual villain trying to take over the world or trying to get revenge plot by simply having people committing crimes for the reason a lot of people commit crimes, getting a bunch of cash so they won't need real jobs. It also makes fun of the idea of a giant made-up city for superheroes to fight in like Gotham or Metropolis, with the city simply called The City. And every superhero comes out of the woodwork, poking fun of the idea that there would be so many costume characters in one universe, and it would get pretty congested. Also, most of them probably wouldn't be any good at it, which explains why the superhero committee, made up of people with Fantastic Four powers, send the nigh-invulnerable guy there in the first place. You've got a lot of fun bad superheroes, like the guy with the red cape sticking out of the back of his jacket who keeps saying, "This looks like a job for," and then he's not able to change because the bathrooms and phone booths are always occupied. He's not named in the episode, by the way, but in the comics he's called the Caped Wonder, which utilizes the same gag. There's the Caped Chameleon, later called the Crusading Chameleon for no real reason I know of, whose power is pretty useless because he faints anytime he tries to turn his color into a pattern like plaid. Big Shot, the Punisher knockoff I mentioned before, and my personal favorite, the Human Bullet, who gets shot out of a cannon to get around and doesn't really do anything once he's there. And one of the episode's best gags is Bipolar Bear, who would fight, but he just can't get out of bed this month. So as I said, we've got two episodes with similar plots but different focuses. One is making fun of superhero properties while the other is working hard to justify having this material in a primetime sitcom for adults. Luckily, Edlund does that more by focusing a lot on Arthur and giving him a real dilemma, rather than pushing the sexual humor or the potty humor too far. Arthur is basically the same character in both versions, but I think he has a little more dimension in the live-action series. During the scene with Batman Well and Captain Liberty, he says, "Well, this has been a shattering disillusionment," and later tells the Tick that superheroes are all a bunch of sexually frustrated kindergartners. No offense intended. And then the Tick keeps the humor going through this character development by saying, "None comprehended," which I love. He's conflicted because he wants to make a difference in the world, but he's starting to think this isn't the way to do it until he gets giddy with excitement about the fact that he helped save a president by the end. So it makes sense that Arthur agrees to keep working with the Tick, but he's also way more apprehensive about it than the cartoon Arthur, and so he feels a little more real. I like that just as he's getting comfortable with it, the Tick gets a fortune cookie that says, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions." After the Tick, and possibly his best line of the whole series, says, "A secret message from my teeth." And then Apocalypse Cow attacks, and the Tick drags Arthur outside to fight an apparently huge cow that shoots fire. Fight fire with Arthur! He truly feels like a regular guy thrust into the madness of the Tick's universe. Now, what the cartoon has going for it over the live-action show is a broader scope, since it's animated, and a real unique visual style accentuated by its jazz score, and it's got one of the best theme songs, I think, in the history of cartoons. The live-action version has a very specific feel to it, too, but I prefer the overall ambiance of the cartoon, an atmosphere that got it right from the beginning. I always thought the live-action show, being a sitcom, was always struggling to find a balance between adult comedy and superhero show. And the pilot got closer to that balance than any episode after it. Had it been allowed to continue, I imagine it would have found that stride. But being a fan of the cartoon, it took time to get used to the idea that the Tick wasn't going to do a lot of patrolling and fighting in the show, and when he did much fighting, it would be off-screen. It was always hard, even in the pilot, to pull off making the Tick look as big and as strong as he was supposed to be. He picks up Arthur and pulls him onto a roof using some wire work. We get a token Tick jumping roof shot where some of the roof actually comes off, and he wraps one of the terrorists up with some twisted metal. But while Patrick Warburton is a really tall guy, he's not 7 or 8 feet tall like the Tick is supposed to be, of course, and he just never really felt quite nigh invulnerable enough, which is impossible for live action on a TV budget, but was also where a lot of the humor of the cartoon came from. My favorite scene in its first episode is where the Tick is falling and he says, "I'll bounce off this flagpole to safety," and he breaks it off under his immense weight. So then he says, "I'll bounce off that broad, flat surface." And when he meets Arthur for the first time, he's stuck in a crater he made, and the flagpole keeps bouncing back and forth through the entire conversation. That's the kind of stuff the other show just couldn't really do, but it found other ways to do physical humor, like the hysterical moment where Tick and the Red Scare headbutt each other over and over again until Tick finally says, "Knock it off!" and when he tries to break the elevator's fall with his own head. Sorry to say, they never had the budget to do this kind of stuff again. A lot of the show's physical humor was in the Tick's antennae, which Warburton apparently complained was funnier than he was. In his commentary, Barry Sonnenfeld says that Warburton would get irritated anytime someone laughed on the set, and he didn't think he was doing anything very funny, because he knew the remote control guy was doing something hilarious with the antennae. They really accentuated his performance. A staple of the cartoon was the Tick's long speeches at the end of each episode, which the live-action series doesn't really have. Sometimes he'll do a short version of this, but it's not quite the same, and Townsend Coleman, who voiced the Tick in the cartoon, was great at those ridiculous monologues. He was a speechier Tick, whereas Patrick Warburton's Tick talks a little less and a little slower. Coleman's is much more melodramatic, and both work for their respective shows. The comic delivery has to be more exaggerated in a cartoon, whereas Warburton can do a lot with his face and hands to make his lines funnier. I know I'm mostly just gushing about how much fun these shows were. They certainly don't have the deep dramatic themes and characterization I usually like to delve into, and like a lot of parody, it's hard to be real critical of them since part of the humor is breaking the rules. As I said, I do like the cartoon better than the live-action show. Overall, it had more consistently good writing, and I like its premise a little more than the stripped-down sitcom thing, which was unavoidable and understandable, but ultimately just not as much fun. I wish there was more comedy like The Tick, as it relies mostly on witty dialogue and clever physical humor rather than shock factor to get its laughs. And most importantly, it took a lot of chances with a lot of bizarre and out there ideas. If I have to rate them, and I really consider not doing that at all, I'll give the cartoon's first episode a 3.5 out of 4 and the live action's first episode a 3 out of 4.
Ba, ba,